Hi, I'm Joanna Barlow, and I wanted to talk a little bit about vaccines in general and the coronavirus, potential coronavirus vaccines in particular. So, firstly, just considering the biblical principles in relation to vaccination, there's no question that vaccines have saved many millions of lives since the first vaccination for smallpox was introduced in 1796 by Edward Jenner. So Jesus said in Matthew 22, verses 37 to 40, that loving God with our heart, soul, and mind, and loving our neighbour as ourselves are the two commandments on which hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, they are key scriptural principles. And being vaccinated and having our children vaccinated is one way that we can both care for ourselves and for our neighbours, and we can contribute to the common good of society. I think it helps if we understand the principle of so-called herd immunity. That comes from the scenario where the strongest animals in a herd protect the most vulnerable ones by exposing the stronger animals to any outside threat and protecting the vulnerable ones. So if enough people are vaccinated within a community to provide herd immunity, it means two things. Firstly, the disease can't get a foothold in the community by spreading. And secondly, that those who can't be vaccinated are protected from infection. So people who can't be vaccinated include those whose immune systems are compromised because of illness or because they're going through, for example, cancer treatment, or perhaps because they're too young to be immunised. Now, the proportion of people who need to be vaccinated to provide herd immunity varies depending on the disease. So, for example, for measles, it's almost 95%. We actually don't know what the proportion is yet for COVID-19. So, some people are anti-vaccination, and why is that? Well, I think there are two main reasons, perhaps apart from just general autonomy questions. Firstly, concerns about side effects, and secondly, concerns about the origins of the vaccines from an ethical perspective. So firstly, in terms of side effect concerns, a paper came out in Lancet in 1998, a medical journal called The Lancet, that stated that the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, had been linked to autism in children. Now, this study was subsequently retracted in 2010 because it had actually been found to be fraudulent. And a subsequent study of about 500,000 Danish children demonstrated that there was no link whatsoever between the vaccine and autism. Now, even though that link has been disproven, it's true that there are some other extremely rare side effects of vaccines. So I do understand why parents might have some hesitations. Now, as with any treatments, there are some risks. I do consider that the benefits outweigh the risks, and that's why I had my sons vaccinated, both for their benefit and for the benefit of others. Now, I think we do need to appreciate that different diseases that we vaccinate for have different levels of seriousness. So, for example, smallpox had a death rate of about 30%, and that's a very serious illness. In measles, the chance of a serious brain infection called encephalitis, where 10% of people die and 25% are left with serious brain injury. The chances of that from just catching the illness is 1 in 1,000, and from the vaccine is 1 in a million or so, perhaps 1 to 2 in a million. For a disease like rubella, rubella is a mild illness in most people, other than in pregnant women whose babies can be profoundly affected by that. So the reason that we immunise for rubella is more to protect others, so mothers who are pregnant, rather than ourselves or our children. We also need to appreciate that some vaccinations are more effective than others. Measles and smallpox are more than 95% effective, whereas flu vaccine, as we know, is not always effective and has to be repeated every year because there are new flu strains that emerge every year. we're not really sure yet what category a COVID vaccine would fall into. Those suggestions are that even though there has been some slight mutations of the virus, they have not been in the same sort of order as a flu type of mutation. Now, in terms of the second concern about the ethics of vaccine production, some vaccines are indeed made using cell lines which have originated from aborted fetuses. Now, viruses need to be inside cells to replicate because they themselves are not truly living organisms in the sense that we normally think of living organisms. They are kind of a bit of genetic material with a protein and a capsule and possibly a bit of lipid. Now, they grow much better in human tissue than animal tissue. And fetal cells are ideal because fetal cells are healthy, they're not already infected with other viruses, and they're able to grow for many generations. Indeed, some cell lines have become what's called immortalized, either through manipulation or by chance, and that means that they reproduce indefinitely or almost indefinitely. Now, two of the most commonly used cell lines in the making of live vaccines come from fetuses that were aborted in the 1960s and 70s. So that's the so-called WI38 and the MRC5. Now, those cell lines are used in making chickenpox, Hep A and B, rabies, and the rubella component of MMR vaccines. There are alternatives to the measles and mumps portion of that vaccine and to rabies, but not to the others. So what are the concerns specifically related to the Oxford, so the AstraZeneca vaccine that's been proposed for Australia, or one of the ones that has been proposed? It's made from an adenovirus, and an adenovirus is a virus that usually just causes the common cold in chimpanzees. This adenovirus is modified so that it can't actually cause disease, and then genetic material that codes for the coronavirus's spike proteins, those little stalks that you sort of see projecting from the surface, are added to the adenovirus. So when a person is vaccinated with it, he or she will produce antibodies to those spike proteins. So then if they subsequently get infected with the coronavirus, the immune system will recognize that and it will attack it because it recognizes the spike proteins. So where do the fetal cell lines fit into this process? Well, they're used like miniature factories to generate vast quantities of the modified adenoviruses. The Oxford vaccine uses a cell line called HEK293, which is a cell line widely used in research and industry. It originally came from a female fetus, legally aborted in 1972 in Holland. HEK stands for human embryonic kidney, and 293 was just the number of the original experiment. This is an immortalized cell line and is considered to be ideal for this task. Now, there are currently well over 100 candidate vaccines for COVID-19. Around 10 of them have entered human trials, and of these, 5 use the same cell line as the Oxford, or another one uses another cell line called PER.C6 from another aborted fetus. Now, you may have heard of Operation Warp Speed in the US, so they're aiming for a vaccine by January 2021, hence the term Warp Speed. And several of those vaccines, use the same cell lines. And those that don't, many of them use another cell line called HELA, standing for the name of a patient, Henrietta Lacks, who was someone who had cells taken from her when she had cervical cancer, and that has a lot of ethical issues as well because she was never compensated for that, and there's been a book written about it if you're interested. All right, so how should we as Christians respond to this? Well, the first thing to say is that it's a complex situation. There's no easy or straightforward answers, and not all Christians are going to agree about it. We do know that vaccines, as I said at the beginning, have saved many lives and prevented serious illnesses in millions of people. So I think that they are a good thing that God has enabled us to be able to manufacture. If we think of polio, for example, it's really a dreadful illness. It's almost been eradicated by vaccination. So when I was at medical school, which is not that long ago, there were still wards of people who were being cared for in iron lungs, these big kind of machines, and they were unable to move. And it must have been a pretty ordinary life, I imagine. So many of the vaccines that we ourselves received as babies were made using cell lines derived from fetuses that had been aborted. Of course, they were not aborted for the purpose of obtaining cell lines, but for other reasons. Now, some believers consider that given that the fetus had been aborted for other reasons, using their cells actually brings some good out of a bad and sad situation. Others say, well, the end doesn't justify the means. Now, of course, in terms of our childhood vaccinations, we as children had no choice. We were just jabbed. And we as parents were not informed. Indeed, I don't remember learning at medical school where vaccines came from. I thought they were all grown in chicken eggs, and some of them still are. Now, in terms of the vaccines being prepared for COVID-19, though, we do have some information and some choices. We do know that the abortions were not performed for the purpose of obtaining the cell lines that are used in some of the vaccines. Now, of course, as Christians, we don't encourage or endorse the practice of abortion. But given that we have not been involved in that process, the Catholic Church have called this the concept of moral distance, that we are some way distant from that actual original abortion. Of course, there may be alternative vaccines that are derived not from the use of fetal cell lines. Some of the RNA virus vaccines won't need the use of cell lines. And if they are effective, then obviously that might be a reasonable alternative. I think the other thing we need to be aware of is that these are not the only ethical concerns about vaccines. There are concerns about their availability in poorer countries and the kind of degree of fairness that we as wealthy nations kind of use up what supplies there are of these vaccines, and so that they're not available for countries that perhaps need them even more. The other question, I guess, is about mandatory or compulsory vaccination, where people are forced to go against their own ethical principles. And I certainly don't think that that's appropriate. Now, it's interesting that some Christian leaders, such as Michael Jensen in Sydney, Reverend Michael Jensen, Anglican pastor, has suggested that though we can't make atonement to the fetuses themselves who were aborted and whose tissues were used without their consent, we could indeed acknowledge, honour, and even name them. And he suggested perhaps, naming the one that might be used for coronavirus, Zoe, the word for life. Okay, so that's kind of a long and complicated chat about vaccines. So what are my take-home messages from this? Well, I think firstly, it behoves us to be informed, to keep up with emerging information in this complex area. And GS&C, the Gospel Society and Culture Committee, of which I'm a part, are producing a series of blogs, and you'd be very welcome to go to our website. I think there's going to be 5. I think at the moment there are 3 there. Secondly, I think that we need to acknowledge that great good has come from vaccines, but it's equally true that it's tragic that much of the good has come from fetal tissue originally obtained by abortion. So GS&C's position, to which I also hold, is acknowledging this question is complex. The fact that we will not condone abortion, but the abortions from which the cell lines were created were performed for unrelated reasons, not in order to create the cell lines. And there is the potential for a vaccine created in this way to do much good. Thus, we would consider it permissible. Now, of course, this is not an official statement from the Presbyterian Church. This is the view of our committee. Now, if there were an alternative vaccine that was not derived from fetal cell lines, that was effective and safe, then I would certainly consider its use rather than the Oxford vaccine. And I think that each of us need to, before God, prayerfully make up our own minds that we need to consider the evidence and put it to prayer and commit it to the Lord. Thanks.